Thank you, Taylor. And while I'm getting this lavalier mic on myself, I should also mention to you that there are materials in your handout folder that address some of the actual laws that are going to be discussed and policy materials for our next panel. So I'll draw your attention to that. In addition, as well, the educational materials and their packets. So you might want to follow along if they're referred to by our panelists in this next session. So with that, I'll mention that we have, for the panel responding to the problems, new tools, new laws, pilot projects. We're really excited about this panel. My name is Laura Ivkovich. I'm the lead policy analyst with the Office for Victims of Crime at the U.S. Department of Justice, and I'm thrilled to be here and serve as your moderator. And thanks to ITAC, Ann, and the board, Joanna and Taylor, for those who have all worked hard to bring this together for you this morning. We are really happy that our panel of experts will be able to walk us through the important new laws, new pilot projects, and new tools for consumers that they've been working on, much of these efforts taking place over the last year and a half. So we have new information for you since the Stolen Futures Forum, which our office was really pleased to be able to co-sponsor with the Federal Trade Commission. So this is really great culmination of work that began a few years ago. So we're excited about that. So today we'll learn more about these efforts, struggles, and successes, and the panelists' calls to action to respond to the problem through better deterrence, better detection, and swifter resolution. So I'm first going to provide a quick intro and overview of each panelist and what they'll cover, and then they'll each have 15 minutes or so for their presentations. So our first panelist will be Steve Sakamoto-Wengel from the Maryland Attorney General's Office. From a deterrence perspective, Steve will cover the new child lock law recently passed in Maryland and offer a behind-the-scenes look into the groundbreaking effort. Steve is the Consumer Protection Counsel for Regulation, Legislation, and Policy in the Consumer Protection Division in the AG's office here in Maryland. I live in Maryland, so I'm thinking in my head, it's in Maryland. Steve has worked there since 1986, and he's addressed consumer legislation related to privacy and identity theft, and we want to thank him for being here today. I also want to mention that the full bios are also in your packets. I'm going to skip reading the entire bio, so just know that there's much more to our panelists than I'm letting on in my intro, so you have that material in your packet. Then our next panelist will be Howard Davidson from the ABA Center on Children in the Law. From a detection and resolution perspective, Howard will address the state and federal responses to the problem of foster child identity theft. He'll give us an overview, explain the policy issues, why foster child identity theft has become a state and federal legislative issue, and walk us through how various states have responded as well as the challenges experienced in implementing the laws. As many of you know, Howard has been actively involved with legal aspects of child protection for over 38 years, leading the ABA's Center on Children in the Law in their child welfare law and policy improvement efforts. I think he'll be also busily working on a conference coming up here in D.C. in July of 2013, and he didn't pay me to say that. I'm just mentioning it. So thank you, Howard, for being here today as well. After Howard, our next panelist representing the industry side of what will be possible is Stephen Katz from TransUnion. From a deterrence and detection perspective, Stephen will give us an update on innovative pilot projects such as Child Scan, All Clear ID, and not to steal thunder from our luncheon keynote, the Attorney General's program, the IRIS program coming up in Utah. And they'll be covering the successes and the challenges in these collaborative partnerships. Stephen is the Vice President of Consumer Affairs and Operations for TransUnion, where he's responsible for operational and management functions within the Consumer Relations Contact Center Service Division, including fraud investigations, policy management, and quality assurance. Prior to joining TransUnion in 2005, Steve spent 20 years in the marketing services industry. So thanks to Steve for being here as well. And then after that, our next panelist, also showcasing unique programs, will be Mary O'Brien, representing the National Identity Theft Victim Assistance Network, and Hazel Heckers, representing the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. From the perspective of deterrence and resolution, Mary will touch on the collaborative work of the National Identity Theft Victim Assistance Network, NITVAN, and its members. Mary will also share insights from two of the members' coalitions, Idaho and Wisconsin respectively, who focus their attention on child identity theft, foster care, and challenges implementing new credit check requirements. Mary is the Director of Special Grants at the Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center, the grantee that was funded by our office, the Office for Victims of Crime, to develop this national network. Mary is a dedicated social worker whose passion has helped guide national projects that address the needs of vulnerable and often underserved victims of crime. Thank you, Mary, for being here. Hazel Heckers, who is with us by phone today from Denver, hi Hazel, will walk us through the issues of Identity Theft Advocacy Network of Colorado, which they've encountered in their addressing of child identity theft. Hazel also comes from a strongly rooted victim services background, having worked as a victim advocate for nearly 25 years, focusing on high-profile crimes, including homicide and crimes against the elderly and people with disabilities. Hazel's joined the Identity Theft and Fraud Unit at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, or CBI, in 2010 and established the state's only 24-hour ID theft and fraud hotline. So thanks to Hazel for joining us as well. Moving lastly to the area of consumer education, we will hear from Stephen Toporoff from the Federal Trade Commission. From the deterrence and resolution perspective, Stephen will cover how the FTC has responded to child identity theft, and he'll showcase important consumer education publications and outreach efforts undertaken by FTC. He'll even walk us through the need for and uses of the Uniform Minor Status Declaration. Steve is an attorney in the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection within the Bureau of Consumer Protection, where he focuses on identity protection matters. Stephen also serves as Vice President of the FTC's Privacy Steering Committee and participates in various federal task forces and outreach efforts on privacy, identity protection, and victim assistance. Thank you, Stephen, for being with us today. As the first panel did, we'll be happy to take questions at the end of our panelist presentations, and we're going to kick it off by Steve coming up to share with us what's been going on with the successful new efforts to pass the child lock law in Maryland. So thank you, Steve. Take it away.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about the bill that was passed in the Maryland General Assembly last year. It's not working. Okay, I'll talk about the bill that was passed in the Maryland General Assembly last year that would basically allow parents or guardians to place not exactly a security freeze, but similar to security freeze on their child's credit, so that if somebody does go to try to open a creditor account, hopefully they'll be blocked from doing so. There were increasing reports regarding child ID theft. Additionally, about 1 in 10 of the complaints that we get in our identity theft unit was from somebody who, upon coming of age, discovered they had been a victim of identity theft as a child. And there was a report from Carnegie Mellon SciLab that also identified that 10% of Social Security numbers belonging to minors had already had an active credit file, with 76% of those being fraudulent. So we knew that this was definitely an issue that needed to be addressed, and we were also contacted by several legislators who were interested in trying to figure out what to do about the problem. We met with several advocacy organizations, we met with the legislators, and we decided that we thought the most effective thing would be to expand our security freeze law to allow parents to place a freeze on their child's credit report if they have one, or to try to create a credit report just for purposes of freezing it if the child didn't have one. Similarly, would allow guardians to place a freeze on the credit of somebody in their care. So, we came up with that idea. We then met with Eric Ellman from the Consumer Data Industry Association. They had several concerns about creating credit reports where one didn't exist for a child, that could create problems in the future. And so we came up with the concept here of creating a separate record. It's not a credit report, and it can't be used like a credit report, but it would be a record for that child that can then be frozen. so that if somebody does try to open credit in that child's name, it would be blocked. And we worked closely with Eric to try to resolve this, and we came up with, I think what is hopefully going to be a really good bill to protect kids, and also serve as a model for other states as well. Okay, so after we were able to reach agreement with them, the bill sailed through the General Assembly, which is good. It had 55 sponsors in the House alone, had quite a number of sponsors in the Senate, and so the bill was enacted. It took effect January 1st of this year. We took efforts to try to publicize it. We issued a press release shortly before it took effect. There were a number of stories in the news in Maryland about the new law to try to inform people about it. We really don't have data yet as to how many people have taken advantage of it, but Jeff Carberg, who's in the back, is our identity theft administrator. He said he's received quite a number of calls from parents who are interested in, taking advantage of the law and, trying to find out how they go about doing it. There were some issues that we went back and forth on, where once that freeze is in place, could it be lifted before the child actually reaches the age of majority where they would be applying for credit? Disability advocates were concerned that there might be a need to open up credit before somebody is able to lift the freeze on their own, and so we did provide that the freeze could be lifted by the parent or the guardian. Also, unfortunately, as the stats showed that a lot of this is done by parents, and there's little that you can really do to stop a parent who's intent upon opening credit in their child's name. Although this would allow a custodial parent to stop a non-custodial parent from, engaging in identity theft with the child. Also, there were some initial reports that some of the credit reporting agencies were not up to speed. The law took effect January 1st, but we're assured that now all of the credit reporting agencies are on board and aware of it and ready to implement the law. Okay, so like I said, it just took effect January 1st, so we really don't have data yet to how many people have taken advantage of it and how effective it's been, but we do hope to monitor that and would be happy to work with any other states that are interested in passing a similar law. Thank you.
I guess this is a microphone. Good morning. Hi, I'm Howard Davidson with the ABA Center on Children and the Law. The center is located in the ABA's Washington, D.C. office. We've been in existence since 1979, and we're a group of attorneys who are working on child welfare, legal, and judicial issues across the country. And I've been particularly interested over the years, as some people in this room know, in child victimization issues. And this is one that came to my attention a few years ago, and it has become a real interest of mine in terms of watching its implementation. I want to thank and recognize my intern, Joshua Porter, who's sitting down at the end of the table from the University of Georgia Law School, who helped me in the process of researching and updating the statutes and state child welfare agency policies on the issue of foster child identity theft. Being from Georgia, he's in a good position now. He understands these issues to go back to Georgia and work on this topic, because Georgia has no law or child welfare agency policy, to my knowledge, on this topic. So it's great that he got to work on this issue with us. I want to start quickly with some reasons why foster kids are at heightened vulnerability for identity theft. But first, a bit of data. There are about 400,000 children in foster care in the United States. That number is declining, so at this point they're probably under 400,000. About 200,000 have been entering every year. An equal number of children, approximately equal number of children, leave the system. But there really is a major national effort to reduce the size of the foster care population. Let me give you some statistics from states. The District of Columbia in 2011, that's the most recent data we have, reported 845 kids in foster care. The state of Maryland, 5,700 kids in foster care. Virginia, 4,800 kids in foster care. Compare that with, say, California, which has reported in 2011 55,000 children in foster care. Texas, 30,000, and Florida, 20,000. Those are the three biggest states in terms of foster care population. So why are these kids particularly vulnerable? Their personal information is more accessible to more people. We believe that misuse of their identities is far more likely to go unidentified for longer because they're in this government system. Children who are abused and neglected by parents may have family members who also misuse their identity, and Russell brought up this very interesting issue about whether abuse of a parent of a child's personal identifying information is a form of abuse or neglect. A very interesting question. Many foster children have parents with severe substance abuse and mental health issues, making identity misuse to pay bills or make purchases are more probable. Also, parents of children in foster care are disproportionately from low-income families who may have themselves have credit difficulties. Many children change settings frequently. Kids, unfortunately, go from too many children go from foster home to foster home, or from foster care to group care, back to foster care. And until recently, this subject has been a low priority issue for many child welfare agencies. Foster kids generally don't have family advocates to help them. That is, they don't have adult support within their families to address these issues, to take advantage of, for example, the Maryland law. Child welfare agencies have, again, not until quite recently, child welfare agencies that are part of government have not routinely looked into foster children's possible credit problems, even during their transition period before emancipation. We'd ideally like every child who has been in foster care, who's transitioning to adult independence, to leave the foster care system with no credit record. And finally, if a youth only learns about the theft of their identity after they emancipate, it can obviously have negative impact on their successful transition to adulthood. And that's why the Child Welfare Agency involvement. We are, in fact, the parents of these children who are growing up in, too many of these children growing up in care. So we have a special responsibility toward them. Now, how did we get involved? How did the system get involved in these issues? I can speak personally that my attention, and I think the attention of many others, began with an article in Newsweek magazine, no longer in print, but the print issue of Newsweek magazine on February 7th, 2009, contained a first-person experience piece by a young man by the name of Jesse Ellison. And his piece was called Sabotaged by the System. And it was really a startling thing. I had never thought about this issue, but it was a startling revelation of what a young man faces who is exiting the foster care system and finding out his credit has been compromised. Well, thanks to the work of the National Foster Care Coalition, its director, John Shimon, is here. The National Foster Care Coalition very quickly took up this issue and formed an identity theft financial security work group, and I'm honored to have chaired that work group. And we came up with recommendations for changing federal law to address these problems. And here is the federal law. I think the principal person we have to thank for this law is Representative Jim Langevin from Rhode Island. This is actually Section 106 of something called the Child and Family Services Improvement Act of 2011. You have the public law site and the language from the statute, which I will not read. This is, of course, what we like to call an unfunded mandate. There was no additional federal money that went to the states to help them do this work. Well, let me just give you some more data to show you how much of a responsibility this is, this provision. As of September 30th, 2011, if we just look at kids 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 in foster care, and the foster care system includes kids up to the age of 21, okay? Just that population, as of September 30, 2011, 77,019 youth in foster care, okay? 16,000 of those were actually 18 or over. About 26,000 kids age out every year, but this figure of 77,000 kids of age 16 and above is about 20% of all kids in care. And, you know, historically, over a quarter of kids in care are in care for more than 2 years. So we're dealing with kids who are in the system a long time, who bounce from one home to another. I'm pleased that the Center on Children Law, we did recognize this issue in 2010, and we publish something every month called the ABA Child Law Practice. And in February 2010, the cover story, a cover article from our journal, is called Protecting and Defending a Young Person in Foster Care from Financial Identity Theft by an attorney. And this has, I think, been a very helpful piece for local practitioners. And that is our primary constituency of the lawyers who are involved in the child welfare system and the judges as well. So there's a continuing need to train lawyers and judges on these issues. Okay. Well, thanks to the federal law, the Children's Bureau issued a guidance to the states, and you have in your packets a copy of this policy, a program instruction, which advises the states on how to comply with the federal law. And it says that states were required in their state plans, their child welfare state plans, to show that they were complying with this provision from 2011 by August 13th of 2012. So states should be on the road to implementation. There's one exception to that for tribal children, children who are being either have tribal affiliation or being cared for by a tribal agency. The compliance date is June the 3rd of this year. The Department of Health and Human Services, through the Children's Bureau of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, has provided technical assistance to state child welfare agencies on effective practices and implementation strategies. There have been several webinars. Steve Toporoff has participated, and I certainly want to thank Catherine Heath from the Children's Bureau and Steve for their efforts. I know there's a third webinar plan on their efforts to educate state child welfare people on the implementation of this. The Children's Bureau has met with each of the 3 credit reporting agencies. They've provided information on how states can best comply. Each of the credit reporting agencies has provided names of key contact people that the state should be in touch with, and they have asked for a court order or other documentation that the child is actually in the agency's legal custody. So there are 8 states that have already legislated on this issue. Some legislated before the federal law. So you see the earliest is California in 2006. And in fact, the one study we have on this issue and the problem of foster child identity theft, the California Office of Privacy Protection, which did the first study of foster child identity theft and a pilot project to aid in correcting fraudulent entries. But here are the states, the 8 states. And then we found, and thanks to Joshua's help, we found a bunch of states that have child welfare agency policies on implementation of this, and they're listed here. Indiana actually seems to be the first to have addressed this prior to the federal law in 2009. And these state policies are very different, some requiring that requests be sent in a batch to the CRAs. Some involve the put the independent living program people who are supporting youth transition to adulthood. They put the independent living folks in charge of making sure that this happens. The only state to have estimated the cost of doing this foster child identity theft checking is the state of Virginia, which estimated the annual state cost at $26,000. And remember that the number of kids in foster care in Virginia is 4,800, and that's all of the kids in foster care. So it's a much smaller number who are 16 and above, and the federal law only deals with the 16 and above. I also have on the slide how some of these policies differ from state to state. One state actually for a long time has had material available for foster youth on the issue of identity theft. That's through the Wisconsin Department of Children and Families. And then here are just some ways in which these state laws differ. And again, I won't go through them, read them all, but some of the states may check earlier than 16. Whether the checks are made to just one or all three national credit reporting agencies. Of course, the federal law requires that the checks be to all three. Checks for all 21 and under youth who are in independent living programs, using contracted providers. Report to the legislature. The Virginia law requires an annual legislative report on implementation and whether new legislation and regulatory action is needed. And here are some others, variations in the law. Some of the laws address these things, others don't. I think the second bullet is very important, that there are kids who are excluded from having their credit checked. And one group, for example, are kids in juvenile correctional facilities. Lynn talked about this. Kids in the juvenile justice system probably are more likely, I have no data to back this up, but I believe this, kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system are even more likely to have identity theft issues than kids in the child welfare system. And yet they are not covered by this. This is only kids who are technically in foster care, however the state defines that, and often that's not kids in the juvenile justice system. And you see these other, I don't have time to kind of go through all of these issues. Virginia assigns an ID other than Social Security number, and I want to talk about that at the end. Okay, issues and concerns as I wrap up. We need to know more about the cost of doing these checks for large numbers of children, what percentage of inquiries result in bad hits, how difficult it is to make the corrections, and who bears the cost of checking and correcting. We need to be talking to foster youth. What do they think about this issue and the checks? And more important, the issue of financial security for kids in foster care. There's a wonderful organization, Jim Casey Youth Opportunities, that has been working over the years on foster care issues related to financial literacy for older kids. I think the organizations that are represented in this room need to partner with other organizations that are concerned with foster youth to help on this issue of financial literacy for kids for youth who are in the foster care system. And finally, the issue of withholding Social Security numbers. The primary identifier for kids in foster care is the Social Security number. And yes, one answer to protect this person kid in foster care from identity theft is to withhold the Social Security number. But I want to call to your attention one problem with that, and that is that the foster parent has, in many cases, the opportunity, and it's important to do so from a financial reason, to claim the foster child as a dependent on their tax return. Well, what do you need to claim a child as a dependent on a tax return? Generally, you need the Social Security number, unless you have some alternative number that you can use on the tax return. Foster parents generally provide support for kids in foster care that is far more costly than what the state gives them in a monthly stipend. For example, the state of California, this is several years ago, but for a 2-year-old child in foster care, California pays $425 a month, but the rate, the actual cost of raising a 2-year-old child in terms of what that child needs has been estimated at $685 a month. So the amount that foster parent gets is inadequate in virtually all states. So this foster care dependent exemption is really important. And so I think it suggests that we need a fix from the Internal Revenue Service. We need some way that foster parents could be provided an alternative ID similar to the W-7 or the W-7A form. The W-7A form has been actually a form that was produced by the IRS specifically for adoptive parents. And I think something like that for foster parents would be extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Is it working good? Yep. Okay. I'm Stephen Katz from TransUnion, and I'm here to speak today to you about a few programs that we've been involved with, some of which you've heard already about this morning. Howard just spoke about the foster care, the federal foster care law, and we've been intimately involved in that program, trying to assist the states to comply with that law. You also heard from Steve about the new law in Maryland, and obviously we're actively involved in supporting that law as of January 1st. I spoke with him earlier, and we've already received some requests from consumers in the state. And then you're going to hear from Scott Morrill over the lunch hour about a program in Utah that we've also been involved with. So we've been quite busy at TransUnion trying to help protect minors from identity theft. Just a couple quick points about us. I think everybody knows what the CRAs do, but TransUnion is headquartered in Chicago. We process, we maintain credit histories on approximately 300 million consumers. That's just in the U.S. alone. We're doing business around the world on 5 continents, and we process billions of updates each month. So that might surprise you. Billions is a big number, and sometimes I look at that and I think, wow, how many credit-based transactions are there going on in the world, and that gives you some idea. Most importantly, I think relative to what we're talking about today, we help to combat and prevent financial crimes such as identity theft and credit fraud through our Fraud Victim Assistance Department, which is based in Fullerton, California, and that's where a lot of these efforts that I mentioned earlier are taking place. Oops, sorry. Technical difficulties. Sorry, one moment. There we go. Just a couple words about our commitment to identity theft prevention overall. TransUnion was the first to establish a Fraud Victim Assistance Department in 1992, and that's the department I mentioned that's out in our Fullerton, California area. We have many people there that are dedicated to fraud investigations, reviewing the paperwork that we receive from consumers, speaking with consumers personally to help them resolve their issues. And that's where we get, for example, some of the information that I mentioned earlier about minors, minor-related issues and adult-related identity theft issues. When I spoke about the fact that we hear that many of the parents that are involved in these crimes related to minors are actually seeking to create a new life for themselves, rent an apartment. That's the team that's uncovering some of that information. We were also in the year 2000 involved in a credit reporting agency-wide initiative to offer identity theft trade line blocking. So if a consumer presents the proper documentation to us, we're able to block a trade line as relating to fraud, so that will no longer appear on their credit report. We were the first in 2000 to enable a nationwide security freeze. So as many of you may know, some states had already enacted laws relative to security freeze, so consumers could come to the CRAs and place a freeze in those states. But there were many states where that was not possible. We decided that we wanted to make that service available to all consumers, and so we did so in 2007, and the other CRAs followed suit from there. And then today, I think this is pretty important when you think about the mindset of the credit reporting agencies, and particularly the mindset of TransUnion. We are the only CRA that empowers consumers to speak with a phone agent without restriction. So there's the ability, obviously, to insist that a consumer have a credit report available to them in order to speak to one of our agents, that you have to have fraud documentation to speak to a fraud-related agent, and we don't do that. We let consumers speak to us regardless of whether they have that information. And consumers contact us with questions. They might not call because they want to put a dispute on their file. They might not call because they can't get a disclosure. They might just have a question. And the question might be, I'm concerned about the fact that my child could be a victim of identity theft because I've had some strange calls to the house, or we received some strange mail. What should I do? And that's the kind of work that I think pays off when you think about the potential benefits of having those discussions with consumers. So through conversations like that and through information that we received in the mail, in 2009 we decided to put a form on our website, a form that would enable parents or guardians to come and in a secure environment give us certain information about their minor, their child, that we could follow up on. So if you're a parent or guardian today and you're concerned about the fact that your child might be a victim of identity theft, you can fill out that form and send it to us. We will in turn respond to you, also via confidential manner, and we'll give you some instructions on what you should do as a next step with us, so that we can determine whether or not there are any issues that you need to investigate. If we look at our files and we see there's no credit file in the minor, no activity, then we'll simply respond to the parent that there's no need to follow up. We also have been involved since 2011 with the state of Utah, and Scott and I know each other. Scott's going to get into some details about the CIP program, which Utah is running. But in 2010, through some industry outreach efforts with some advocates, we came together with Utah to talk about the potential for a program that would enable parents to take some action on the file of their child, or a guardian to take some action on the file of their child, that would help prevent identity theft. And we were anxious at the time to not create a file. Obviously, that's something that we are not anxious to do. And so we were looking for alternative paths. And Utah had a system in place called the IRIS system, which gave them some unique benefits that we were very interested in. And the effort that we undertook with Utah essentially enabled us to receive certain information from the state about the child, and the parent would come in as an authenticated individual, so we're able to take certain action on our file. And that action took two forms. The first form of action is we would check to see whether or not there was a file in our system on the minor. If the file existed on the system, we would suppress it so that it could not be accessed. And then the second action that we would take is we'd place the SSN of the minor in our high-risk fraud database, so that if there were any inquiries based on that SSN, a creditor or lender would receive notification that that SSN was at higher risk for fraudulent use. So Scott will talk about that more. I think it's a wonderful program. We receive updates from them regularly, and I think Scott's been getting great feedback from the residents of the state on the program as well. We also have been actively involved, as I stated, on the state foster care agency efforts, and we have a program that's available to small businesses, where small businesses can come and access online with permissible purpose the files of individuals. And we made that same system available to state foster care agencies free of charge. So there's absolutely no charge. We have an expedited membership service that enables the foster care agencies to come in, and we've been very pleased with the results of that. We have multiple states already signed up for that service. And then we, of course, enable residents of states that have specific laws to avail themselves of the services that they're entitled to as well. That's an ongoing effort. For example, we're doing that in the state of Maryland currently with the new law, and we're proud to be able to support those efforts. A couple of things I want to talk about for consideration. As I mentioned, we have these two programs, the Utah program and the Maryland program. Obviously, quite a bit of thought went into the creation of both of those programs. We at TransUnion, we feel there's really no need to recreate the wheel. For example, Utah has at its disposal an engine that could be applied to any state's efforts. This authentication that they can provide would enable a CRA to be able to take the type of action that we're taking. So as other states look to solutions for child identity theft, we'd like them to consider working with Utah, and Scott has indicated they're willing to talk to any and all states. And then the Maryland system as well. I mean, if a state is looking at a freeze type solution or a creation of a specific record, as was stated earlier, for the purposes of creating that freeze on behalf of a minor, that model already exists. So we'd like to see the pursuit of that type of a model. And then just a word about how a single federal agency can make a big difference. I think there was a lot of talk earlier about the use of SSNs, and I know the SSA has the ability through programs like the CBSV program to check with consumer consent whether a specific SSA belongs to an individual, and we'd like to see potentially the SSA look at a solution where they might be able to extend that service at no cost to a state that was interested in working through a program to make use of such a solution, like Utah, or ideally even on a national level. So we've had TransUnion has had some conversations with the SSA. I know Utah has as well, and we'd really like to see some continued participation from the SSA and potentially look at a solution like that. And then the role that we can all play in terms of moving the fight forward. I think we need to remain innovative, open to new ideas. We need to press those with the resources to take some form of action. And then we need, of course, to keep minors' interests the priority of our efforts. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary O'Brien, the project director for the National Identity Theft Victims Assistance Network, known as NITVAN. And we began a few years ago with funding from the Office of Victims of Crime through a collaborative agreement with OVC and Maryland Crime Victims Resource Center, as was mentioned earlier. We act as the structure that basically provides the technical assistance, training, fiscal oversight and management for 10 sub-grantees who then in turn coordinate multidisciplinary identity theft coalitions in their states. And you can see the map there. So what all of these coalitions really have in common, the main goal of the whole project is to really better the response to victims of identity theft in those states and regions. So these are the 10 coalitions that are, and networks and alliances that are operating across the country now under the NITVAN umbrella. And as you can see, they're all coordinated by very diverse entities, some of them systems-based, the Arizona Attorney General's Office and CBI, who you'll hear from in a second. And some of them are legal service agencies that coordinate the coalitions in their state. Some are traditional victim assistance networks, South Carolina and Washington. And some are interested in senior issues, the agencies. Also, Battered Women's Legal Advocacy Project comes from that background. So very diverse in terms of who coordinates these coalitions and also in terms of the population focuses. So out of this 10, 3 of them, which we'll talk about today, are really focused quite a bit on leading the efforts in their state on child identity theft, implementing the new foster law, and working really as a coalition to coordinate education and outreach on those things. So just to give you kind of a little bit of a snapshot of what some of the interesting things these folks are doing. Otherwise, though, just to kind of encourage you to check this out, Texas, for instance, has created a mental health curriculum, intensive mental health curriculum aimed at therapists, as well as modules for the general public, so that in cases where the impact is really severe, the therapists will be prepared for that, and they're offering CEUs in exchange for service to victims. So quite an interesting program there. And I mentioned Minnesota. They're really the first identity theft coalition of their kind to focus on identity theft as a tool for power and control in domestic violence situations. So they're doing some really exciting work there. And then Lifespan and Idaho are both focusing on senior identity theft issues. The New York City Coalition is focusing on immigrants and low-income populations whose Social Security numbers might be sort of easy targets for people wanting to work elsewhere or things like that. If you're homeless and you're having trouble keeping a hold of your documents and that sort of thing. So very interesting issues there. Arizona, among other things, is focusing on identity theft of veterans who are away serving, as well as seniors and also immigrant populations in their area. And I'll let Hazel talk really about her child identity theft efforts, but I gotta also kind of say they've been doing quite a bit there in Colorado in medical identity theft. So they've brought in experts and trained through this project the major medical providers in Denver, the major hospital systems, and have ended up really through those efforts, busting huge rings of medical identity theft and being able to take care of that in a really collaborative manner. So, all right. So, although they're all doing very unique, really interesting things, they really the main thing in common that all of these 10 groups under the NITVAN umbrella have in common are that they are really doing 3 things. They're educating the community, heightening awareness, so that victims will know where to go for help, and basically so that people across the community know that this isn't really a simple issue that some people may believe it is, stolen credit card only, that sort of thing, so that people understand that there's, quite a bit of diversity of experience and victimization in this topic, and that the impact can be quite severe on the victim. Also, professional education, so that this is really the heart of the most of the projects, is to lift up the ability and knowledge of the folks throughout the state, whether it be law enforcement, victim services, child welfare agencies, etc., so that they can better serve those victims when they come across them. And that finally, systems change so that the interagency infrastructure, the referral system, the MOUs are in place so that they know who one another are, they know who's working on the issue, they know who has the resources and where to send victims that need next steps that others can provide, and that sort of thing. So find out more about us online and contact me with more details. All of these coalitions have in some way an internet presence as well. So for the folks out there on the phone listening at home, you can come and find out more about your local group. And we'll talk a little bit more about maybe how you can get involved. And we just have, I just wanted to highlight a few resources online that we have. So we have a whole page on our site about child identity theft victimization targeted towards victims and parents that can help them. And I encourage all of you to provide feedback to me on that. I'd love to hear from you on how that's working out. We have a resource map where you can click on any state and find the identity theft laws that are applicable to your area. You can find out the agencies there that can help, and online information as well. We have a news feed where you can learn about our upcoming webinars. For instance, our next one is going to be on cyber security in regards to identity theft, and our recent one was specifically on foster care identity theft issues. So you can sign up for our listserv and get on our mailing list there. We also have a calendar, which is a good spot for all of you guys who are interested in this issue to learn what's happening, and also submit to me your events, and we'll get them up there and get the word out, and that sort of thing. So we try to post pertinent issues online with the news feed, for instance, Hurricane Sandy related, getting information out about that sort of thing. So. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what the coalitions are doing. And like I said, 3 of them are really focusing quite a lot of attention on this issue, Idaho being one of them. They've really done, I think, probably a 3-step approach to working on the new foster care legislation. They've developed a whole training curriculum which seeks to talk about the prevalence in their states, talk about the victim impact, talk about how you can assist the child in being able to fix that issue, and talks about where to other referrals in the state and that sort of thing. So it's a really good training that's focused on the state, on the issue, that the coalition has developed as a multidisciplinary team so that they can go in and train the foster care workers, which they're training all across the state, to do this, to help the children in very much a multidisciplinary way, so that law enforcement officers, victim service providers, that sort of thing, can talk together about the issue. And then they're doing outreach and more trainings to the community as well. So they have a training curriculum developed specifically for the foster care workers, as well as for the general public and other parents, just on child identity theft in general. They've partnered with the Casey Family Foundation, which has been really helpful in getting their word out. And of course with the Department of Health and Welfare, also with the schools. And this has been really made possible through the strength of the coalition and working as a coalition in that manner. As part of that training, they've also developed a written packet, sort of written materials, but also a packet for the children that is kind of looped into the training, so that the foster care workers and parents that receive the training are aware and know how to deliver this packet to the children. So it's targeted and written for the children, and that helps basically by offering information sort of targeted in that voice and for that population, offers existing material such as the FCC's material on child identity theft, as well as that localized information that the statewide coalition has been able to sort of focus on for Idaho. So if you want to know more about this, please contact the coalition coordinator, Sunrise, and her information is there. She'd be very happy to hear from you to get ideas and share information. So I want to talk a little bit about next Wisconsin. Wisconsin has had kind of reported some of these challenges out to the rest of the coalition, and they've been, receiving some of the same sort of complaints that we hear. Companies continuing to try to hold youth responsible. There's some confusion with the membership about the CRA's response, and everybody's trying to get this issue, get this law implemented and get this issue worked on. And so there's kind of some stretch marks in that, and they're working with quite a few police agencies, but there's always going to be issues taking police reports and that sort of thing. And thankfully, through the coalition and through the law enforcement partners that are working very well on the coalition, that's a good avenue for addressing those that need that education. So they're really right now doing similar things to Idaho. They're hosting an online webinar across the state. They've developed curricula as well, and They're providing tons of outreach on the issue in general, and they're making themselves as a coalition available to caseworkers for difficult cases and making it clear to caseworkers how they can seek assistance and make those referrals that they need. So Ann's your contact there. She's the coordinator of the Wisconsin Identity Theft Coalition. Again, she'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Hazel on the phone. And Hazel, I'm going to stay up here and flip through the slides for you. So you can,
okay. Thanks, Mary. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yep.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Well, it might seem a little odd for those of you who are there to have this disembodied voice talking, so Mary might act some of this out while we're going on, and I'll also be asking her to forward the slides. So my name is Hazel Heckers, and I work at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We do host a 24-hour identity theft and fraud hotline, and there is no age limit on people who can call and get advice from the hotline, so youth can also give us calls if they would like to. We have established in Colorado the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and our 24-hour hotline as kind of the place that works as the primary resource for coordinating victim assistance for victims of identity theft, so that there's a one-stop shop for victims of identity theft, whether they are children, youth, or adults, to call and get that kind of response. And then through the Identity Theft Advocacy Network, we can do outreach to the most appropriate victim advocate or the most appropriate legal support system or whomever is needed for that person to provide comprehensive care. So Mary, if you could move forward for me, please. So one of the things that we felt we needed to do in terms of responding to child identity theft was to ensure that we had that same kind of team approach or that collaborative response. Our Colorado legislature did pass some legislation in response to the federal laws in 2011. And that does require that credit reports, I say ensure, but it really actually requires that credit reports are pulled for all youth in foster care during their transition period, so between the ages of 15 and 18. The legislators also required that the Department of Human Services in Colorado work in collaboration with any other agency that existed in Colorado that had a kind of a vested interest to design a plan and a resource list so that if victims of identity theft were identified, there would be some resource and some assistance for them in responding to that. Because we already had the Identity Theft Advocacy Network of Colorado going, we kind of provided the ideal support for that kind of action and entered into a partnership with the Departments of Human Services across Colorado to make sure that this plan was pretty comprehensive. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the great things that our task force did was to design a plan that included kind of step-by-step instructions, not only for the caseworkers and technicians that were part of the Departments of Human Services, but also for GALs, for foster parents, and for kinship parents. We worked with some representatives from credit reporting bureaus, from law enforcement across the state, and anyone else who we thought was a key player. We kind of contacted them to help design the plan. And one of the things that we felt was that the legislation was a little bit lacking in that it only spoke to credit reports. It didn't speak to other forms of identity theft. So we decided to kind of go above and beyond and create a system by which if there was any indication that a child had been a victim of identity theft of any sort, we as law enforcement would assist the Department of Human Services if it was a foster child or a parent if it was a child who was still living in their home, in doing kind of a full background report to identify any other form of identity theft that might be going on, employment, identity theft, criminal identity theft, any of those other pieces. We really felt that training was kind of key to our success, and so we developed several curriculum for the general public, for foster and kinship parents, for the Departments of Human Services, and for law enforcement. So next slide, please. So one of the things we felt was key was that if the Department of Human Services was going to be the primary access for foster youth, that they really needed to be trained. So we started by training supervisors in all of the pertinent departments, any kind of child response team, and sometimes that includes caseworkers and community-based programs that work with foster youth. We trained each of the departments within the state, so we have a state Department of Human Services, but we also have county departments, and we decided to train those. And then we also went to some of the conferences that are offered for caseworkers and for child protection workers throughout the state of Colorado. We felt that it was equally as important to train the foster and kinship parents in issues, so we attend their annual conferences. We attend monthly trainings that are offered through the county departments, and then they do this great thing called the Foster and Kinship Parent Boot Camps, and we do attend those. They happen about once every 6 months. Then we also felt it was pretty important to train the court personnel, because these were people who would not only be overseeing some of the actions that we were taking, but they might also be the people who would notice something that might indicate identity theft first. So we did some training for GALs, for CASAs, for judges, and for magistrates. So next step, please. Okay. So one of the things that we felt was really helpful was that we hosted some lunch and learn meetings throughout the state, because a lot of people can't get time off to go to a conference or to go to a full-day workshop. And a lot of our departments of human services, if their child protection staff is busy going to a conference, they're not available to do their work. Somebody's always missing something. So we did a series of lunch and learn meetings throughout the state where we invited people to come on a lunch break, have lunch with us, and then get just kind of the basics of response. One of the great things that we felt was important to do, and we've been able to do, is to do cross-training, so that there's really a collaborative environment. And the cross-training between the Departments of Human Services and law enforcement in their community, or between the financial institutions and the Departments of Human Services. So we felt that was really helpful. And then we went and did some lunch and learn trainings at high schools for the teachers and for the counseling staff. We especially made sure that the people who ran the financial literacy programs at each of our high schools were included in those trainings. And, in addition to that, we also did training for the kids. And the kids love to have us come and do training for them, even if they don't fear that they're victims of identity theft themselves. They like being included in the whole process of having that training for them as well. And so next slide, please. One of the things that we as a law enforcement agency think is really important and is often missing from response to identity theft, and especially identity theft of minors, is the law enforcement inclusion. And so we were really happy that we kind of were able to take some of the lead on this to ensure that law enforcement stayed in the loop. One of the benefits that we see is that we can provide that complete review of the minor's history, and that helps identify different forms of identity theft, not just the financial identity theft. And then the other thing is that we are usually the agency that can assist in correcting many of those problems. So having us be a part of that up front really assists the recovery process in being a much easier process for the youth. One of the things that we do is encourage medical records review and better options for maintaining consistent information for foster kids throughout placement, because medical identity theft, as Mary mentioned, we are becoming the experts on medical identity theft. It's huge in Colorado, and I think it's big across the nation, but we are just identifying quite a bit of it here. And for foster kids, one of the biggest problems is that if they're in multiple placements, they may be receiving multiple treatment from different facilities. And so it's a little bit harder to look at your medical records and make sure that everything is correct. So we talk a lot about that and the role that law enforcement can play in assisting doing that. We also want to remind people that credit reports speak only to one kind of identity theft. And here we more often see criminal identity theft for foster kids, and more often than we see the financial identity theft. And then, like I said, we know from experience that criminal ID theft is a frequent issue for the children and youth that are in foster placement, mostly, as you've heard throughout the day, mostly perpetrated by a biological parent or one of their associates. So next slide, please. we really see the value of partnership, of having multiple agencies involved, not just the people that you think about, the credit reporting bureaus, the departments of human services, law enforcement, but also engaging the banking industry and including the medical facility staff, getting employers involved, and really educating everybody who is involved in the entire process. This increases reporting. A lot of times people will be victims of identity theft and not report, and it is important to us as law enforcement to have that reported so that we can do investigations and ultimately prosecute the people who are perpetrating these crimes. And I think one of the benefits of this kind of partnership is that we are able to identify times of greatest vulnerability for children and youth who are in foster care. We are able to give caseworkers some indicators that might say to them, this is a time that we should be especially cautious, or, oh, that's a red flag. I think we better check and see what's going on with this child's ID. And that's something that we can only do because we work in a partnership together. And one of the most important things, and as a victim advocate, to me this is the most important thing, is that when you have a coalition of people working together on behalf of victims of identity theft, you can empower those children and youth to act on their own behalf. And when a youth is, especially a youth who's been in foster care and has had a lot of their choices taken away from them, when you give them the option to access this great support system and to make decisions for themselves and to seek justice for themselves, it makes a huge difference in their recovery. Okay, next slide, please. One of the things we did through all of this was to create some materials. So we definitely developed a state-specific guide to child identity theft. I have to say that we use the FTC's guide as our kind of indicator of things that we needed to include, but we wanted to make it very specific to our state and very specific to questions and cases that came in through our offices. We also include information for the minors in foster and kinship care, not only for their foster and kinship parents, but for the kids themselves, and for parents who are not part of the system, but who find that their children are victims of identity theft as well. Our materials kind of explain what a credit report is. It explains the difference between a fraud alert and a credit freeze, and it really explains the value of knowing what your credit report is, but not only knowing what's going on in your credit report, but also seeing that as a potential indicator of other forms of identity theft. If you're seeing that you have financial identity theft, it's a good time to check and see if you have other forms as well. And so kind of in that vein, it encourages a complete law enforcement background check to detect other forms of ID, which is a service that we at Colorado Bureau of Investigation offer at no cost to anyone involved, to the Departments of Human Services, to the kids, to the foster parents, to the parents. So that is something that we just offer as a contribution. And then the materials also address medical identity theft, and they do provide kind of first steps for what should you do next if you've discovered that you or your child have been a victim of identity theft. Okay, next slide, please. So what we always remind people is that whether you're an adult or a child, there are a couple of enemies for the identity thieves. One of them is early detection, and that's why we encourage, and we're so excited to see the federal and state laws that encourage checking children's IDs fairly early on, checking their credit histories, checking what's going on in their backgrounds, so that we can detect the identity theft as early as possible. And then following that early detection is quick action and quick response. And, you know, those things not only assist the child or youth who's the victim, but it also helps law enforcement identify suspects and make arrests. The longer that someone is able to go undetected, the more difficult it is for us to find them sometimes. So getting that information quickly and being able to respond quickly is really important for us. And so, you know, I think that in Colorado we are pretty excited about how well we are working together as a group and as a coalition, and we're excited that we're able to bring in so many diverse partners into working towards ensuring that, trying to reduce the number of youth and children who are victims of identity theft, but also that if a child or a youth is a victim of identity theft, that they have a support system there, that they're not going to fall through the cracks, that we're going to be there with that safety net and help them through that so that they can be successful as adults. And next slide, I think, is just my question slide, and I'd throw this in because I love that picture. So that's all that I have, and thank you very much. I'll just throw it back to Mary.
I'll just say really quickly, if all of you on the phone and in the room are wondering how you can get involved to help offer your assistance or also just get a hold of these materials that have been developed, Russell Butler will be talking about that later. So.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Did it work? Okay. So good morning. Again, my name is Steve Toporoff, and I'm with the Federal Trade Commission. And I head the Identity Protection program at the Commission. But also with me today are several others, Lisa Schifferle, Cheryl Thomas, and Megan Cox, who are also part of this effort. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what we do at the Federal Trade Commission before I get into the substance of my remarks. At the Federal Trade Commission, we have a specific mission when it comes to identity theft matters. As you know, the identity theft is a federal crime, but identity theft is prosecuted by the Justice Department, not by the Federal Trade Commission. We are strictly a civil law enforcement agency. But what we do focus on is complaint collection and also outreach. And much of the work that we do in complaint collection is through our Sentinel database, which anybody who is a victim of fraud or identity theft can file a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission electronically or by phone or other means. And that goes into a database that is available to over 2,000 law enforcement partners. On outreach, what we generally try to do is use our resources, and like all federal agencies nowadays especially, we have limited resources. So we try to target our efforts on where there seems to be either underserved populations or vulnerable populations. And perhaps one of the most vulnerable populations is children. So we focus, one of our projects focuses on children, and as you have heard, Stolen Futures, that's the title that we have given to this project. And within the project, there are several elements. First was, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second, our Stolen Futures Forum. But we also engage in outreach on many levels, including media awareness, congressional testimony, and public and private coordination. So, there we go. So, Stolen Futures was a forum, and many of you in the room participated in that effort, and I thank you for doing so. And that took place in July of 2011. And that was a coordinated effort between the Federal Trade Commission and Office of Victims of Crime. And the topics that we focused on are many of the topics that you're hearing about today. The scope and the impact of the problem, foster care, familial child identity theft, protecting data in the schools, and solutions. After the forum, when we looked back at what we had heard, we came to a few conclusions. And basically what we decided was there were 4 areas in particular that we wanted to focus on. First and foremost was outreach to parents. As you might imagine, we receive a fair amount of contacts by consumers on a wide variety of issues. And we were finding over and over again that parents would call us either concerned about their children being victims of identity theft, reporting specific instances, or just generally seeking information about what they should do on the subject. And at that time, we really didn't have any specific advice
for parents. Clearly, foster youth was a major consideration, and we held a panel discussion on that at the Stolen Futures Forum. Also, we thought that there probably is a need for guidance for young adults who had been victimized as children, who may not have the resources and the support or the knowledge to go through the process of cleaning up their bad credit or other ramifications from the identity theft. And then lastly, we thought about familial. When identity theft happens within families, and that's a real tough one, because we could create all the brochures we want if there are parents who are criminals, basically, in some instances, drug abusers or others who abuse their own children, either physically or financially, and have no qualms about using their child's identities. That creates a problem. That population is not going to search on the FTC's website for identity theft materials, for example. So we thought about familial issues, and what we thought we could do to make an impact is at least to provide information to those parents who really don't want to abuse their kids, but they might be just ignorant about using a child's social security number, for example, to turn on the lights, to have utilities, that kind of thing. And perhaps by having information available to that segment of parents, we could possibly make a dent in the child identity theft problem. So outreach. So one of the first things that we did, again after the forum, was address the need for a general guide for parents. At the same time, we updated our general guide on identity theft, which is called Taking Charge, and that includes some materials about child identity theft. But the main publication, and there's copies of it on the counter over there with the other materials, and this is what it looks like. I don't know if you have copies do you have copies? Oh, great. Great, okay. And so, again, Safeguarding Your Child's Future is the guide for parents, and it covers a number of topics. How to keep personal information safe, how to properly disclose of children's personal information, tips about safety and sharing information with children, warning signs, the whole issue of does your child have a credit report and next steps. And then a new feature that we created is the Uniform Minor Status Declaration. So I'm going to touch on 2 points that are raised in Safeguarding Your Child's Future. I'll start with the Uniform Declaration. A number of parents asked us, okay, so what do we do? How do we contact the CRAs? What do we do about this? At the same time, we heard from others who do this kind of work in the field, and they raised a very good point, and that is for many children who are victims of identity theft, the federal remedies that are in the Fair Credit Reporting Act don't necessarily mesh well, and we heard a little bit about that. And in particular, if we're dealing with very young children for sure, but even older children, as we heard, under state law, and it varies the age and the circumstances, but as a general proposition, children, teens, young teens, cannot enter into credit transactions. It's not necessarily illegal, that's my understanding, but it's not enforceable. So if you have a contract, let's say with a young teen, for whatever reason, that probably is not enforceable. So, so one way of looking at identity theft is if a parent can prove that their child, at the time of whatever the transaction is that they're claiming that the child is liable for, whether it's a loan or a mortgage or whatever, at the time that the child entered into this, if they were a minor, they should be able to get out of that transaction. It should not be enforceable. So one way to do that as a tool for parents is this declaration. And there's no magic about it. Parents could write a letter to the CRAs or debtors and do the exact same thing, but this is just a handy way of helping parents go through the process of documenting who the child is, the nature of the transactions at issue, and providing this, again, to the CRAs or to debtors to address identity theft in the child's name. Another issue that we address in safeguarding a child's future is the whole area of synthetic IDs. And you have heard about this earlier today. And that's when somebody, the identity thief, uses the child's social security number and then other information. And the problem is, if, let's say, I'm a parent and I go to a CRA and I'm looking to see if my child has a credit report, and I give their name in, right, and their date of birth and their social security number, it could well be the case that the CRA does a search on those three variables. Okay? Name, date of birth, and social security number. So, and what happens in that circumstances is there may not be a hit because somebody could be using just the social security number alone. So what we have advised parents in the guide is to search for just the social security number alone. And that may be a good tool for finding out if that child's social security number is being used by others. Another issue that we dealt with after Stolen Futures is our Back to School guide. We worked with the Department of Education to put out materials for parents as their children are going back to school, and the whole area of protecting information in the school system. So that's available. I don't have copies of it, but it is available online. So in addition, we have participated in any number of webinars, presentations, and community outreach on child identity theft issues. Media awareness. We can't be everywhere at the Federal Trade Commission, so in large measure we rely on partners. And one of the partners, if you will, is the media. And in untold number of instances, we get requests from media by reporters for information on identity theft generally and child identity theft specifically. Sometimes it is a consequence of some local issue. Some child has been a victim, and that gets covered by the press, and then they come to the Federal Trade Commission. And here are some pointers of the issues that we try to alert the media to. We explain the scope of the problem, the consequences to the child of identity theft, examples of federal criminal prosecutions, the warning signs, because as you have heard, a lot of times parents have no clue that their child is the victim of identity theft, and resources for parents, including the guide and some of the other materials that you heard about today. Whoops. Went too fast. Okay. Congressional testimony. From time to time, we visit with Hill staff to inform them on child identity theft issues. And there were several hearings, one in particular in September, which focused specifically on child identity theft and the use of Social Security numbers. And the last point that I want to make is about coordination. As I said, we can't do everything alone. And one of the key issues that we're focusing right now is foster youth identity theft. As you've heard, the Innovation Act, that's how we refer to the Foster Youth Act, requires the child welfare agencies to get credit reports and assist in cleaning up credit reports where they exist. And very early on in the process, we were informed that we can be helpful to those involved in the process because, as you might imagine, the child welfare agencies don't typically do this kind of business and don't necessarily have the expertise. So we have been working with HHS to bring them up to speed about what credit reports are, how to get credit reports, how to read a credit report, and how to remedy instances of identity theft in a credit report. We have worked with OVC and a host of others, most recently the CFPB, and we are hopeful that two things. One, we can find solutions, easy solutions for the states to get credit reports, and then the tougher issue, and that is when you do have a credit report that shows identity theft, what are the steps that the child welfare agency is going to need to go through in order to clean up where there is a problem. So that's pretty much it. I should mention, keep jumping ahead. There's my contact information. Welcome to contact me at any time. I should mention, as I said before, we focus on vulnerable groups, and another vulnerable group that we're focusing on this year is seniors. So this spring, on May 7th, we're hosting a forum, just like we did on child identity theft, on senior identity theft. And some of the issues are parallel. It's just like children's information is circulated widely, makes them vulnerable. In many instances, seniors, their information is circulated widely in hospitals, among doctors and others, nursing homes and other care facilities. So there are parallels between the two. And that ends my remarks. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists. This is the question and answer portion of this panel. And as a reminder, for those in the room, please use your microphones placed around the conference tables. And for those who are out there in the Ethernet, please make sure that you ask a question first through the webinar chat room and tell us the question you'd like to ask. And then when you're called on, then you'll be asked to press *6 to unmute yourself and then ask the question. I want to try and go to Hazel because she's not in the room right now, so I'm going to give her the benefit of a question, and also because it's sort of my own hope and interest that those who use phone agents or consumer counselors or victim assistance reps to take the calls. If you're a federal agency like the FTC or state SSA or IRS, if you're taking calls from the public as victims, wanting to know that there has been a crime or providing resource information to those clients, what type of training is most useful for those agents or phone counselors or victim service reps? And so, Hazel, I'll ask you, from your work on a hotline and helping to train others in the state, what has worked well with training the people who are taking the calls from a trauma or victim perspective? Do you have any protocol on that, or the kinds of training that you do that others might learn from a victim perspective that you could share?
Sure. We do have some criteria, and I think that all of the agencies that you've mentioned, it may be quite different. I think it will be quite different if you're answering the identity theft hotline at the IRS than if you're answering the identity theft hotline that we have here in the state of Colorado. And the difference is that ours is a victim assistance hotline. And so it's our expectation that the people who answer our phones have gone through extensive victim assistance training so that they're available to give the kind of mental health support, the system support, the advocacy support, kind of all of those pieces that someone can expect when they call a victim assistance hotline. But then in addition to that, they've also gone through an 8-hour training that we provide specific to issues of identity theft and fraud with a follow-up of additional continuing education every month. Those people who answer our hotline also have 24/7 access to the Victim Assistance Program here at CBI, to not only the Victim Advocate Program here at CBI, but also to our agents in the event that a police officer calls in with a question that they need to have answered. So I think it's pretty critical if you put yourself out as a victim assistance agency and a victim assistance hotline that you have that kind of training, that you know how to be a victim advocate, that you know how to identify someone who is calling with a mental health issue, that you know how to identify someone who is potentially suicidal. And even though you may not think it happens with identity theft, it does happen that people become suicidal. That you know what resources are available in the community to provide the safety net of support for people who, because of the ID theft, can't afford their rent or can't afford their medications, or are having problems because someone worked in their name and now they no longer collect their disability and they got booted off of Medicaid and so they need their oxygen. So it's important to know the resources, and we feel that victim advocates who are well trained have that information. For some of the other hotlines where you're taking calls and it's more specific to financial identity theft or to fraudulent tax filings or something, I think it's just really important to have good customer relations. And, in law enforcement, we're not always the most user-friendly agencies, and we're not always warm and fuzzy. And so one of the things we've tried to train law enforcement agencies, especially dispatchers, about is that the just the facts attitude is not always helpful with victims, and that it's helpful to have a little bit more of a compassionate response. And also, if you don't know the answer, be willing to put the person on hold while you find it or while you find who does have the answer. I think that's the biggest frustration that we've heard from victims who've called other hotlines, some of the federal agency hotlines, is that they feel that the person on the line was not well trained and did not know about the issue. They've even had people say, well, this isn't really my job, I'm just filling in for someone today. And that's really frustrating for someone who's called what they expect to be an expert. So that's my answer. I hope that answered your question, Laura. Hello?
Yeah, we got it, Hazel. Thank you.
Well, sure. I mean, as an initial matter, all of our consumer ed materials, whether it's in identity theft or other areas, is available in Spanish. So our identity theft materials either currently is in Spanish or we have a project to make sure that they are in Spanish. But at the Federal Trade Commission, we work more on the train the trainer model. So, for example, we don't engage in direct victim assistance as some of the other state and local agencies might. But we have any number of programs to go out and speak with legal service providers. We go to training sessions. I, for example, have spoken at the National Hispanic Bar Association specifically on identity theft. Others go to, we have regional offices, and there's a whole program of common ground meetings where people speak with state and local AGs and others about fraud and identity theft work. As you may know, we have a very detailed pro bono guide on identity theft that we make available to legal services and others. And again, what we mentioned before, we participate regularly in various programs like this, webinars. We make our information available for free to others. We have a toolkit on how to put together an identity theft day where people in the community could take that material and put on an event on how to prevent identity theft. So we have a wide range of materials, but again, we can't be everywhere. So what we try to do is train the trainer, basically.
I had a question actually while we're here in the room, and that's about the prevalence of state laws. I mean, we heard about the Maryland law, and I'm just curious if either Steve from Maryland or Howard from the ABA have a sense of the extent to which other states are considering enactment of the kinds of laws that we heard about from Maryland.
I was speaking with Eric Ellman earlier, and he had indicated that there are several states currently looking into it, Delaware, Florida. Eric, do you know of other states that are?
There are a few others, but I think that's a good start.
Okay.
Yeah. And in terms of the foster child identity theft laws, because of the federal legislation, which really didn't kick in until 2012, you're just beginning to see state legislatures consider this. So Delaware and Virginia passed laws since the implementation date of that federal law. I've heard there's a bill pending in Maryland specifically on foster child identity theft, and I suspect there'll be a lot more states that legislation isn't absolutely necessary for child welfare agencies to do this work, but legislation can facilitate the process. It can also guide what happens when you do have a problem with a child's identity, a foster child's identity being stolen. So I suspect that we found 9 states that just
ITAC for its hospitality and warm welcome to this conference. It's a beautiful event. I've learned a lot. There's a lot of information being processed here, and I'm going to take a lot back to the state of Utah and utilize it. It's fantastic information. Now, I'm going to talk about 2 things today. Our Identity Theft Reporting Information System, IRIS, which is our identity theft site, and our Child Identity Protection Program, which is our CIP. Now, first I'm going to give you a little history here in the state of Utah. So in the state of Utah, we began working on identity theft back in 2000. That's when identity theft was identified in statute. And 3 years later, our legislature gave the Attorney General's office authorization to investigate identity theft crimes statewide along with other state or law enforcement agencies. Before that, our Department of Commerce was handling identity theft crimes, and they were kind of dealing with it. But really, about that time, meth was a big issue in the state of Utah. And so the criminals using IDs were becoming more and more dangerous. And so they needed an agency that was post-certified, carried weapons, and could handle some of these identity theft investigations. So in 2003, they moved that authority over to the state of Utah and allowed our agency to start investigating identity theft crimes statewide. And, of course, that didn't disallow some of the other agencies to stop doing it. But that's kind of what happened. So once our agency got that authority, we began to become inundated with identity theft reports. And they were all over the place. So we brought on board about 5 investigators, a dedicated prosecutor, and we were dealing with identity theft. We had a couple people sending out packets of information to victims, and calls were coming in left and right. And they were complaining they were not getting the service they needed. They didn't get the help they needed from everybody associated with it, law enforcement, financial institutions, CRAs, everything. Everything was kind of causing a major headache. And we needed to do something about it. We needed to help these victims identity theft out with this issue. And we thought, well, let's do something, but let's do something with technology. Maybe we can use technology to help these victims out. Not only we can do something for the crime investigative-wise, but let's see if we can walk them through the process, get the information where it needed to go, and give these folks some help where they needed the help badly. So we began devising a way, something we could do. So we came up with a process. Well, let's develop a system that would take the information from a victim and get it to wherever it needed to go. And that would include law enforcement, financial institutions, CRAs, the FTC, anybody that could help these victims out. However, in order to do that, we needed to get some buy-in. We needed buy-in from legislators for funding. We needed buy-in from law enforcement statewide because we wanted to involve them. We needed buy-in from the financial institutions, maybe retail merchants. So we held a summit in 2003 to get their buy-in. Everybody came together, and we came up with a concept to build a system that would help these victims out in the state of Utah. And since then, we've been really working hard at this after that initial buy-in. We've gone around the state, met with all the law enforcement agencies to get their buy-in before we got started. We kind of developed the system, got a plan, and began working on it. Not only that, in the state of Utah, back in 2000, when identity theft was first identified as on statute, our legislation hadn't evolved. So, you had an initial identity theft statute, but you really didn't have all the help that has come along over the years with the evolution of statutes and law. Some of the major important legislation that we passed in the state of Utah, one is really, really helpful. And I'm not sure if any other state is doing this, but our Department of Workforce Services is allowed to notify parents that somebody's using their Social Security number for employment, notify them either for their purpose or for the children that's being used. We've also passed legislation that allows 15-minute thaw on the credit freeze, made it a penalty if a merchant leaves on your credit receipt, the credit card number, And we also wrote legislation for our program that I'm going to talk about today. We exempted the information in it, made it private, protected information. So in our state, we have a GRAMA law, our Government Records Management Act, which allows people to do a government request for that information. We exempted it from that law, so nobody can access the information. We also made it a felony if anybody tampered with the information. So we've done a lot of work legislatively to evolve the legislation in the state of Utah to make it easier for prosecutors and investigators to deal with this crime, as well as building a whole project that helped the systems out. So after all this work, 2003, we had the summit. We began designing and building it. Finally, in 2006, we brought it online for the first time. And since 2006, we've made lots of additions and changes to the system, so it's really a much better system when we first brought it online. So since 2006, we have over 3,000 reports of identity theft, and these are reports statewide, so the system is statewide. 3,000 reports may not seem like a lot, but in Utah, it's not too bad. Over 50% of the reports are Social Security number related, and that number has gone up higher and kind of come down a little bit recently. So a lot of them are dealing with Social Security number issues. Specifically dealing with that legislation I spoke about with our Department of Workforce Services notifying the public that somebody else is using their social for employment purposes. As part of that process, the Department of Workforce Services sends out a letter to those folks and says, look, you're a possible victim of identity theft. Either contact your local law enforcement or report it on IRIS. So a lot of our reports come from victims of Social Security theft. Over 1,000 reports of child identity theft. And we know that because we have a certain process in the program where parents identify what type of what type of Social Security fraud they're involved in. And so many are child identity theft cases. Over 200 Utah law enforcement investigators are working with us on this system. Now that's a huge deal to get that many officers on board to work on a program. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail a little later on, but that really is a big part of what we're trying to do. We're victim-based, we're trying to help the victim out, but we can't help the victim out without law enforcement. So over 200 Utah law enforcement investigators are working on this project. Over 11,000 kids now protected in our CIP program since January of last year. So within a year, we have 11,000 kids, and I haven't checked today, but a lot of kids in our program. So I'm going to concentrate on three key elements of our system today. There's a lot of resources on the program, but I'm only going to concentrate on three. The online reporting, which is really the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. We have a lot of information on a website, but really the online reporting is the backbone of our system and what we're trying to help the victims out with. The law enforcement interface, what we're doing with law enforcement, the work involved, how they interact with the system, and what's going on with the law enforcement side. And crime mapping, a really cool tool we have online that shows where identity theft is occurring in the state of Utah. So first of all, the online reporting system, which is our IRIS system, and you hear IRIS, it's Identity Theft Reporting Information System. It's a program we've had online since 2006. And what it does is allows victims to enter reports of identity theft. We walk them through the process, get the law enforcement, get information back to them. So I'm just going to give you an overview of how this whole system works, but it's in much more detail than that. What we want to do with the victim is help them with the situation. And as we've talked about today, there's multiple types of identity theft cases. Social Security, IRS, all sorts of credit card, banking, you name it. On our system, the victims can choose from all these different types of identity theft cases, types. And they probably are victims of more than one. They could be a victim of Social Security, IRS, unauthorized transaction, whatever it might be. They can select whatever type of victim they are. From that, our system walks them through the process of clearing their name based on the type of identity theft they chose. So if they're a victim of unauthorized transaction, we walk them through the process of contacting your financial institution, gathering information to organize your case, because really organizing your case for victims is the key. We want those victims to be organized. When they go to law enforcement and they have an organized case, that officer is more likely to take the case than if you just walk in with nothing. So the key is providing them the educational information on how to resolve their issue. And that's all built into our system. educating the public on how to deal with the crime. So organize your case, contact a financial institution, and as part of our process, they can also initiate a fraud alert. So right in our step-by-step process, we educate them what the 90-day fraud alert or the extended alert are, how to activate them, how to remove them, what the FACTA Act allows them to receive with that, and they can initiate a fraud alert right in the reporting process. They can report the crime, they can report transactions, date of occurrence, primary joint accounts, suspect information, and a text description of the overall case, what's going on with the situation. And what we found is victims really like to write. And so these descriptions, they really are descriptive on the information they're providing. So all this information, what we're going to do is send it to law enforcement. So we're going to send it on up to our database, which is the key of our system is our a statewide Utah Criminal Justice Information System. So that's our backbone. That's where all the information is fed. It's stored in one of the most secure databases in the state of Utah, fully encrypted, multiple security issues placed on that so nobody can access and get into it. So we're pumping that information up into our system. That's great. We've got over 100 law enforcement agencies in the state of Utah that are participating in the program. How are we going to get those reports to the right jurisdiction? Well, it took us a while to figure this out. So we get the reports from the victim, we get all the information, giving them step-by-step instruction, helping them out, getting the information in our database, but how do we identify the jurisdictions? We thought, well, perhaps we can use zip codes. Maybe we can use a zip code to identify a jurisdiction. Problem in Utah, multiple jurisdictions cross zip code ranges. So that didn't really work out. So we finally found a solution. We developed a database. It was a mapping database, kind of like Google Maps, where you enter an address, you pinpoint the jurisdiction, the exact pinpoint of where the offense occurred. We layered the jurisdictional boundaries for the state of Utah on top of that map. So you enter an address, pinpoint the jurisdiction, and now we know exactly where that report needs to go. And we base that on the location of occurrence, and if that's not known, it's where the victim lives. So we try to get it to where the crime occurred, but if it's not known, it defaults to the jurisdiction where the victim lives. So we identify the jurisdiction based on a map. We take that report and zip it on down to our law enforcement. So now we got on a map, we know where the crime occurred, we've identified the jurisdiction, and you law enforcement folks, we take the ORI number for the agency and associate that with the map, and that's how we get it down to our law enforcement. Now, law enforcement, that was a critical piece to get those folks involved. We developed a special piece of software that sits on every investigator's desk. So it's not on the web, it's not live, we developed software. And we worked with a company in Utah that develops record management system software. And for law enforcement, record management software is where they keep the reports. It's how they issue the case numbers and everything else. When a report comes in, they enter it in their record management system. So we developed with a record management system developer in the state of Utah, developed this piece of software that sits right on the desktop of the agencies. And in the state of Utah, the Utah Attorney General's office paid for 2 licenses for every agency throughout the state of Utah. So we're paying for that software to sit on their agency's desktop. So the report, when it leaves the victim's desk in about 5 seconds, it goes over to law enforcement. It takes about that amount of time to get over to the investigator's desktop. And the full report is sitting right there on the investigator's desktop. They can pull it up, view it, look at all the different transactions, everything involved with the case. They can print out a nice report and they can omit secure information, do whatever they want with it, submit that out to the victim if they need it. They've got all the information. They can investigate the case, and when they're ready to send a response back to the victim, they can do so. So they can send a case number, an update, a status of the case, whether it was closed, whatever the status of the case would be, submit that back to the victim, and a little bit of helpful instructions. So that information then goes back to the account of the victim. So two-way communication between the victim and law enforcement is what we've developed to help these victims out. What the victim really needs is the case number and contact information from the law enforcement, the free credit freezes, and other help from financial institutions, merchants, whoever else needs that information. So they need that case number. That's what we're submitting back, the case number, contact information, investigator's name. So they have that information to begin clearing their name. along with all the process and information that we gave to them. They can print out all the helpful hints that we provided them. Everything's printable. They can take everything with them. So now we've got this two-way communication with the victim and law enforcement that we've completed. That's our IRIS system kind of in a 10,000-foot level view. Really, there's a lot of reports involved, a lot of forms involved, and a lot of complicated databases, multiple databases at every location to make this work. I gave you this 10,000-foot view because I didn't want you to get cluttered up with the forms and everything else. But it's really a nice process that we have in the state of Utah, and it's something we would like to see distributed outside of Utah. Because as we all know, victims' identity theft are not just in one location. There are multiple locations, perhaps in multiple states. If somebody could report a crime in California, Wyoming, or Nevada, and have it go to Utah where the crime actually occurred, that'd be fantastic, or vice versa. If we could shift those reports back to the law enforcement agencies where they need to go, that'd be fantastic. But really, getting law enforcement on board took a lot of time. We've spent over a year going to each one of the agencies in the state of Utah, providing them training on our system, investigative technique training. So we're teaching them not only on the IRIS system how to use it and what we're providing to the public, but we're also teaching them investigative skills, how to investigate identity theft crimes. And what we found is law enforcement really needs that help. They need to learn how to investigate identity theft crimes. So on the law enforcement side, as soon as they get a report, they get a pop-up notification. Because the key is, some of our rural areas in Utah may not get a report all the time, maybe once a year, maybe once every other year. So if we required a system where they had to log in all the time to check and see if there's reports, they'd get discouraged and stop using it. So we developed a system that would just notify them when the report was there. It would pop up, so you have an instant report waiting for you in the system. Log in and receive your report. So it's an instant pop-up notification. It reminds them of the report. It just pops up by the system prompt so you have reports waiting. So a pop-up notification for law enforcement. Didn't require them to log in, but when they got a report, they knew it's there. They could log in and get the report right on their desktop. All reports are added to the IRIS database. So all of them, from law enforcement to the victims, everything's stored in the database, which is key. So we have a database that's searchable. All law enforcement agencies participating in this can search the reports through their client that we installed on the computer, so they can search reports and across jurisdictional boundaries. So they can search all the reports that are in there, which is really helpful. They're looking for suspect, financial instrument, whatever is involved with the case, they can search on that report. Another fantastic piece of legislation we passed in Utah is cases in Utah can be aggregated. So if the victim lives in one jurisdiction, but the crimes occurred in multiple other jurisdictions, this law enforcement agency can aggregate those cases and investigate it in their own jurisdiction. Now, many of you who have spoken with law enforcement, and you hear about these stories, and they'll say, well, the victim lives over there. I'm sorry, it's not my jurisdiction. I can't help you. Or, somewhere else. They'll always try to pass on the other jurisdiction. But in Utah, we can aggregate those cases. And we have to educate the law enforcement agencies that this law is out there. They can aggregate these cases no matter where the crime occurred, as long as either a crime occurred in their jurisdiction or the victim lives in their jurisdiction. They can aggregate those cases and increase the penalty in most cases. So it's a really nice piece of legislation that we passed to help law enforcement out with these cases and help victims out with it. Also, the system provides instant messaging. As I mentioned earlier, all the information stored in a database, searchable by law enforcement. Now we want law enforcement to communicate with each other to help identify where these cases need to go, or help, have you worked on this case? Have you worked on this suspect? So they can communicate within the system to identify and help each other out, investigate, and hopefully prosecute these cases. So instant messaging, access to the reports, everything is involved in the system. In addition, we're providing victims an affidavit and report. So as soon as they submit a report into our system, they can print out an affidavit, and it's the FTC affidavit basically, that we pre-fill as much information in it as we can, and we put on top of that their instant number from the system and a copy of the report they can print out. So they can print out their report and an affidavit with instant, and both of them are instant numbers. They're not quite as good as a case number, so it's just an instant report. So what we really want is law enforcement to issue the case number. We're providing the instant report. So that is our IRIS system and how it works kind of in a nutshell. We have an online reporting system, sends reports to law enforcement. Law enforcement can respond to the victim. Everything's stored in a database, searchable by law enforcement, and law enforcement can communicate with each other within those systems. Now on the mapping system, which is really cool. So we use the same technology that we use for identifying the jurisdictions. So I'll bring up the website. Maybe. Okay. So we thought, well, why don't we take the same technology where we're identifying the jurisdictions and build a map and inform the public of where crimes are occurring in the state of Utah and what kind of crimes they are. This is our website. Like I said, there's many more resources available. We have an education site, provides all sorts of education on identity theft, step-by-step instructions. Everything's on the education side with all the information on the CRAs. And we have legislation. So all the laws that we pass are on here as well. We have scams and alerts. A validate victim search, which instantly validates victims' identity theft. So if somebody wanted to find out if they're a victim of identity theft and they reported on here and law enforcement has responded, they can click into their instant number and it'll show the law enforcement agency the case number of the victim. So an instant validation. Doesn't show the victim's name, just the last name. A media center and our mapping. So our mapping, as I mentioned, let me see if I can. Okay. There you go. I can get to it. So you can see we can search by, let's see, the type of identity theft, the time, the counties, the cities, any type of method we want to search. So if we want to search on bank fraud, unauthorized transaction from your bank account, we could search on that, the time, just the county or just the city. Any method of searching that we want to do. So I'm just going to search on all for the last 6 months to see what happens with that. Let's see if I can. As you can see, we've got reports in Utah, and it probably doesn't mean much to you because it's Utah, but you can see the Great Salt Lake over there. But you can see, if I click on a balloon marker, there's a Social Security fraud. Or if I click on this red one over here, unauthorized credit. So we can identify the various types of identity theft that are taking place in the state of Utah, and it's instant. As soon as somebody reports on this map, reports on IRIS, it shows up on the map. Now, I didn't want to identify where the victims live, so I'm just going down to the county level. So I could go down to the street level if I wanted to, but I certainly don't want to identify the victim's identity theft. So we just went to the county level on this, but you can see that we have it all over the state. And we also have a legend down at the bottom that identifies what the balloon markers are. So you just run your cursor across, just for informational. And then I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see the entire state. But you can see that this system collects reports statewide. Not just in the main metropolitan areas, but everywhere throughout the state. And it kind of... But what I want to show you is that we are getting reports all over the place with identity theft, and you can identify what kind those are. And so, maybe one day law enforcement can maybe we have a trend over here. Maybe we have as you can see over on the west side of the valley, we have a lot of Social Security cases happening here. So maybe we can data mine this information and identify a trend. Or maybe there's a identity mill that's taking place over in that area of the city. Anyway, that's our identity theft map, which is really kind of cool. It identifies where crime's occurring, what kind it is, and time frame. So it really is interesting. When we get calls from the media, what kind of identity theft, the biggest type of, the greatest numbers of identity theft you're receiving, I can look on the map, I can quickly give them a calculation and show them what type of identity theft is occurring, where it's occurring, and answer those questions quickly. I'm just going to click out of it. Close all tabs. Okay. Not good. So that's our map. So we've got the mapping. Like I said, there's all sorts of other resources available on the website that are helping victims out. But a lot of information not only for us, law enforcement, victims, the media, a lot of information we're providing on the website. Identity theft for children. What do these kids have in common? 6-year-old boy with 2 assumed names working since 2005 in Utah. 4-year-old boy who's had 7 jobs since 2004. 4-year-old girl from Utah working since 2003 at various locations and using at least 2 different names. These are reports I had on my desk before I left for Washington, D.C. And I have lots more. I'm telling you, this is just the beginning. What do they have in common? Yeah, they're kids. They're victims of identity theft. Anything else? What is it? What about it? Be more specific. Okay, I'll help you out. Social Security number misused on average 4 years before their date of birth. How is that possible? I tell you, in the state of Utah, our office has a secure task force that goes out and takes down document mills all over the city. They're selling Social Security numbers and other federal documents on the street. You know, you'll walk down maybe a car dealership or a record store in the front, but behind there's a document mill, and they're selling documents. We'll go in there, and there'll be stacks of blank documents all over the place. This is what we're taking down, and this is what we're seeing. Social Security numbers being misused before the kid's born. How is that possible? How is that Social Security number getting out even after it's been identified as being misused? Anyway, that's a big problem, and that's what we're seeing in the state of Utah. And so what we're trying to do is develop a system to kind of deal with this type of situation. And as you can see, a headline in one of our local newspapers, identity theft involving children is a growing crime. However, Utah parents have a tool to keep information safe. And so, therefore, we developed a system. We have the IRIS system. We could help adult consumers, but for all this time, we couldn't figure out how to save the kids, help the kids. What could we do to help the kids? We can help the parents. We can give them credit freezes. We can give them fraud alerts. We can help work with the law enforcement side, but what can you do with the kids? Couldn't really do anything with the kids. So we began doing some research. We actually looked at legislation of creating credit freeze for children, but after communicating with the credit reporting agency, TransUnion, Steve and his folks, that's not a possibility. They're not in the business of creating credit reports. So we decided to go a different route. We decided to become a partner with TransUnion and develop a system that would not require legislation, that was helpful for the family and kids, and would protect them for a long time. So this is our Child Identity Theft Protection Program, and I'm going to concentrate on 3 key items in the program. The parent-guardian validation process, which is key. TransUnion really needed that validation process before we could move forward. Protect kids' identity and remove at 17. Now this is really a key process that we wanted to make, and developing it was key. And we tried to develop multiple ways of dealing with the parent-guardian validation. You can go back to that. But parent-guardian validation was really the key of getting this whole process work. But we needed to do a pilot project before we could move forward with TransUnion to see if this was even plausible. So our Department of Workforce Services, as I mentioned earlier, has the right or the ability to look at the socials, the names, and identify people that are being using that number in multiple locations. So they gave us a list of 750 children in the state of Utah that were under the age of 12 who had their social being used by somebody else for employment. We sent letters to the 750 parents or guardians of those children to identify and ask if they would participate in our pilot project that would allow us to take their information, put it in TransUnion's database, do a search, and keep it protected for 17 years and see what happened. Of those 750 participants that we asked to participate in the program, 15 opted out. I don't know why they opted out, but they opted out. Anyway, the results from that were significant enough for TransUnion to partnership with us in that program. Once that pilot project, that was our initial pilot project in this program, once that was taken care of and we were able to move forward because of the results of that, we knew it was significant that we could begin helping kids. So our system, this is our Child Identity Protection Program. I'll give you some screenshots because it kind of helps out. The first thing you do is you see our website, and you have 1, 2, 3. As you saw from my previous screen, whoops, protecting your child's identity is easy as 1, 2, 3. We wanted to keep that theme going throughout the whole process. And we added some information, how this whole process works, what's going to happen to your information, and when is it going to be released. And if they wanted to find out more information, they could click on our privacy notice and learn all about the whole system internally and what's going on, our partner, TransUnion. They click on that, and the parent-guardian validation process. Now, this is the key. What we want to do is validate the parent to make sure they are who they say they are. And we looked at many different ways of doing this. Not only we looked at our state's what's it called? I slipped my name. Anyway, we looked at multiple ways of doing this. One day I was watching the news and I realized our state had online voter registration. If they're doing online voter registration, they're doing validation. There's got to be some validation process the state's doing that allows for online voter registration. So we began looking at that. We also started looking at the Social Security Administration to see if they could help us validate. And we're going to do the CBSV process. But the process for that was so much work and so time-consuming and so costly, because really what we want to do is add a service at no cost. And we tried to convince the Social Security Administration that we wanted to provide this service to protect kids from Social Security theft. And all we want to do is a true-false validation on the kids' information. And they denied us that service. But they would give us the CBSV service. And there's a cost for that. There's a $5,000 startup fee, a $5 transactional fee, and we have to keep record. We have to keep SSA 89 form, and other court documents that show the parent-guardian relationship. That we'd have to keep those documents on hand for at least 10 years, and there could be audits and sort of stuff. So that really wasn't a workable situation. So what we came up with was the DMV process, which is our online voter registration process. And this is really key. What we do is we take the name on the driver's license, the driver's license ID number, the date of birth on the driver's license, and we validate that information at the DMV. So the parent guardian enters this information, and in order to participate in the program, they either have to have a state ID, a driver's license, or a driving privilege card. Now, the driving privilege card in the state of Utah doesn't require a social security number, but it does require a tax ID number. So they have to have those pieces of information to get into the system. Without that, they can't get into it. And we've had lots of requests to get past that, and we can't get past it. So this is our process. If any information is false, a false response will come back. They're rejected, and they're given some information on how to correct that. For example, if their information's wrong, say they got married or something, and the information on their driver's license is incorrect, they can contact the DMV and get that corrected. Along with all the correct information, a true response is sent back to our system, and the expiration date is also included in that true response. Now we have an expiration date, and all the name, license, and date of birth are all validated. So we validated all this information. Once we have the driver's license expiration date, now we can determine if it's a valid driver's license. If it's valid, meaning the date is not expired, then we'll let them process the forms. Now, once they're going through the process, now they can enter the children's information. Now, we're going to take kids' information, as many as they have. If they have 5 kids, they can enter them all. If they have 12 kids. In Utah, they probably have 20. So, they can enter all those kids as long as they're between the ages of 0 and 16. Because once 17, they're removed from the system. So we'll take their information, their name, date of birth, social security number, and really, if they have a previous address, we want that information too to help TransUnion kind of really identify who these people are. So we want previous address that they have, it, social security number, date of birth, name, and we're going to submit that. The information goes in. They can add as many kids as they have. They can add additional children. They can edit this. So if they've added incorrect information, they can make an edit, delete it, change it, whatever they need to do to make the changes. Submit it. Once they submit it, it's submitted successfully. They can no longer edit the information. It's gone. However, they can print the information. They've got now a certificate they can print. They also receive an email indicating when they reported it, time frame, and that sort of stuff. So they get an email response indicating. Now we're going to protect the kids at TransUnion. Thank you. The kids' information is enrolled in the high-risk fraud alert database. Now, Steve mentioned that earlier. Now, they're going to do some proprietary checks on that information, but it's going to be stored in their high-risk fraud alert database. If a credit file is found on one of these kids, they will suppress it and send out a letter. Now, once I initiated this program, and I started seeing letters going to parents in Utah from TransUnion, I said, you know what? We have created a really cool program in Utah that is actually helping kids out because we're sending the information in. TransUnion is responding with letters and helping these parents out. What a cool program that is. I really realized how cool of a program that it was once we started seeing those letters go back to the parents, and that TransUnion trying to help those folks out. Customers of TransUnion receive an alert if they're attempting to acquire credit using one of their enrolled children's names. For example, if you're out there and you're using one of the enrolled children's name and you're trying to acquire a car, mortgage, or any type of loan, and they're using TransUnion as the credit report agency, they'll get a response back. And it'll indicate that they need to double-check this information before they issue the credit. So we're protecting the information in the high-risk fraud alert database, suppressing the files if needed, and stopping the credit from occurring in the first place. And then, when they turn 17, they're automatically removed. They don't have to do one damn thing, and they're out of the system. At 17, they're out. So they can go on and get their own protection. That's, in a nutshell, how our system works. Right after we brought CIP on board, guess what happened? Headlines. Crazy, wasn't it? Scope of Medicaid breach explodes in Utah. 850,000 names across the country involved with this. State of Utah just launched CIP. What a deal. We had something to protect kids. We had something to help people report identity theft if they had it with the IRIS system. We also had CIP to help parents in Utah protect their kids against the data breach. So what a timing that was, when that turned out to be. Data breach, CIP is available for the state of Utah. They already put the system in place when that came on board. So we had a system for taking care of data breach issues. We not only had a reporting, but we had a way to protect kids that was never available before. However, we learned there were gaps in our protection. Mentally disabled young adults and adults. Mentally disabled people who may never obtain credit in their entire life. How do you protect their credit? That's a gap. We didn't have a way of solving that issue. We still don't. We're still working on that. 17 to 8-year-olds without credit history and possibly even with a mental disorder. You have these gaps where you can't help these people. In our process, they can't enroll. We can't protect them. They can't get a credit freeze. They can't get a credit report. There's gaps of protection. Kids in foster care. We talked a lot about foster care today. I don't have a way for a state agency to enter foster care kids into my program. First of all, I don't have a state agency who wants to take on the responsibility of clearing those kids' names. Possibly deceased kids. I had parents call me with deceased kids who wanted to protect their kids. What have we learned? Ongoing training for law enforcement is mandatory. You have to keep training them over and over again. Officers change positions every couple of years, so that rotation of training never stops. You have to keep training them. IRIS must make law enforcement's job easier. If it doesn't make their job easier, they're not going to use it. So we have to develop a system that provides them the information, gives them the information, helps them out, and makes their job easier to deal with identity theft. Need to protect kids in the care of government. That's what we really need to do is figure out a solution to that. Product awareness, product awareness, product awareness. Getting the word out to the public that we have these services available at no cost is key. And how to do that. One other thing that I didn't put on here that we learned is you can develop a project, you can plan it out, you can make it perfect and say this is how we're going to build it and this is how it's going to happen. What we didn't plan for is once we got the project in place, what do you do once it's successful? What do you do once it's in place? That's the hard part. And what you need to really plan for is once you get it up there, what do you do to make it successful and keep it successful? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, now I'd like to open up the floor for another Q&A session with Scott. Yes.
John Sherman again. Yeah, I guess just a question. Why wouldn't the state or the agency input foster children when they come into the system?
Well, I don't have a way. I'm talking about the CIP program. I don't have a way for them to enter mass amounts of kids into the program. I'd have to develop a process for them. I don't have it in place yet. That's why. They want to. They've called me and contacted me. They want to do it. And what we're seeing, 3% so far of our foster kids have credit history. Only 3%. California, as I understand, has 5%. out of LA County. So, we're at 3%. So still 3% of the kids. But they want to do it. I just don't have anything in place, and maybe I'll be able to develop that shortly. Yes, sir.
My question is, what do you think it would take for every state attorney general's office to institute a program like the Child Identity Protection Program? In terms of law, federal law, financial resources, what would it take for this to put to scale across the country?
The only thing I need is a validation process from each state. I need that validation process. Once they have either a DMV validation, I could wrap them through my system and do the whole thing.
No, but I mean, Virginia could do this through its attorney general's office.
Just a matter of,
they could just model this system.
We don't have legislation in place.
Right, you did it without legislation,
right.
And any other state could.
They could call me up and say, Scott, we want to participate. And I say, okay, let's figure out how to do it.
And how about funding? Is that a problem for you?
Well, they'll have to fund the development on their side, but it only cost me $60,000 to build that. So that's hardly anything.
Well, that's important.
Right. So that part wasn't expensive. The IRS was expensive. CIP was relatively inexpensive. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a capability for the non-technical victims that want to put their information either into IRS or CIP?
That's a tough.
Do you have a
We've
phone call?
often thought they could go either to a victim advocate, a financial institution. Someone could help them out because there's a lot of elderly people that can't access, don't have computers. Somebody would have to help them out. I don't have a way to make it easier. They can't call someone in my office and we'll set them up. So they'd have to go to a victim advocate in their local jurisdiction or a financial institution to help them out.
So it's online only.
Right.
I have just one quick question, and that is, does the CIB system work outside of the credit reporting system for the types of, like the criminal record ID theft or medical record ID theft that we had heard about earlier?
No, that's a good question. Our legislature is looking at that. Now, what they would like us to do, we're not doing it right now. So what they would like us to do is any kid with a credit history, they would like our office to then investigate those crimes. Now, we haven't gotten to that point, but that's kind of where they're headed. And one of our last hearings that we went to, that's one of the main questions they asked our office is, if you find a kid with a credit history, what are you doing for them? What are you going to do to help them out? We don't have anything right now, but that's maybe coming down the pipe. Yes. I don't know the numbers. Steve might know the numbers, but I don't know the numbers. I've just seen letters going out. I don't know that number, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
On the mapping, which is really an interesting technique, you said that you showed it to us at the county level, which was great,
right.
But that you could go down to the victim level?
If I wanted to.
But what my question is, I'm assuming that is that there are protections about who can access that free, even if I'm a victim. If I went on, would I then be able to see where other victims, I mean, by name?
Down to
yeah, down to that level?
Anybody can look at it. It's open to the public.
But victims' names are not listed?
No victims are just county-level crimes. So at the county level, you can see where the crimes occurred relatively.
Right.
I mean, it's pinpointing it, but you can't, from the map, you can't tell. The technology's there. I could easily drill down, but we're restricting that view on the map.
Well, that's what I wasn't sure about, because it sounded as if actually you were able to drill down lower to get...
Not to the public.
Not to the public.
Right.
That's what I
know.
Good. I'm happy for you. The public doesn't need to
know. No, the public does not need to know where that victim... The problem is, some farmer in rural Utah is the only one down that street.
Yeah.
The only one out in that valley. You might be able to identify who that person is. We thought about that long and hard, how we might be able to hide that, but it's really hard. Yes, ma'am.
Following up on the geocoding technology for mapping, as this is a commodity for a lot of people, as are drugs and guns and prostitution or human trafficking, are you overlaying those crimes to see if there's any... Okay.
No. Our site specifically deals with identity theft, and we've been working really hard not to deviate from identity theft from this program, to have this only identity theft, and not. There's been a lot of pressure on us to kind of go into other crimes, cyber crimes, or all this other stuff. But we really just wanted to focus on identity theft and make sure that's the key information that we want to provide, and that's what the site does. But technology's there. we do have a program in Utah that we are paying for. It's called Crime Map, crimemapping.com. Now, if you go to that, anywhere in the country, and a lot of jurisdictions throughout the country, you can identify the crimes that are taking place. Now, in our state, the Utah Attorney General is paying for every law enforcement agency to participate in that program. So you can identify from that program where other crimes are taking place.